Hi and welcome. I am Georgiana Danetz. For today we will go together through the marvelous adventure of spiritual evolution, and I will shortly present what it contains as a summary at the beginning, and then I would be grateful if you also will ask some questions. Today, the workshop for today, the webinar for today is as the title says, the adventure of spiritual evolution. It is seen from the perspective of the 7 chakras as 7 necessary stages of evolution that we all go through. In it also contains some of the hinders or some of the traps that the ego will, of course, lay in front of us when we start our spiritual evolution. And for all of these hinders that the ego presents for us, I will also come with some practical solutions. So now let's start with it. It may seem strange that we so rarely stop to reflect on the existence of this I we speak so often of. I eat, I read, and so on. In fact, who is the person that lives within us and is in contact with the outer world as well the inner one? Where does it come from and where is it going? Certainly it is alive, but we wonder what life is, the unknown, fascinating, frustrating phenomenon which is expressed through us and which for so long swings between sadness and a kind of an insecure happiness. What does it serve for? Does it have a purpose? If so, what is it? Can we learn it? If so, can we understand it? The more we think about these questions, the more we become aware that by answering the first question, we can answer them all. To know who we are means to know where we come from, where we are going to know what life is and what it serves for, which is the purpose of our life, which is its goal. In reality, all these questions are only versions of the eternal interrogation. Who am I? The revelation of the immortal supreme self is actually the ultimate aim of any spiritual evolution path, no matter if that specific evolution path, that tradition calls it the immortal supreme self or calls it the true I. It doesn't matter the name because the reality is the same. But the revelation of our immortal supreme self, or Atman as it is called in the yoga tradition, makes really possible to move from the limited individual ego to the broader self that allows us to become tangent with the infinite and also to have a wonderful feeling of embracing God. When we manage to accelerate our spiritual evolution and to have this enthusiasm of spiritual practice so that our number one goal is discovering who we really are. When we reveal who we really are, then there are terminated the differences of this simple ego, and thus the ego is transcended. And we will go beyond the smallness of our ego, because the ego is the one creating a whole illusion which makes us believe that we are limited, mortal, and so on. So the revelation of the immortal supreme self is an essential, fundamental, ultimate goal for any human being who is on a genuine spiritual path, no matter which that spiritual path is, and as I already mentioned, no matter what name we give the true self that everyone has. The revelation of the immortal supreme self in our inner universe makes possible also the discovery of the ultimate godly truth. And also it reveals to us God, the Father, in the hypostasis of a live, mysterious, eternal spark existing in every human being. We often are a little bit trapped in this mental perspective upon reality. And we believe many times that we know the truth. But when we will start having glimpses of the ultimate godly truth, we will realize that until we will discover this ultimate godly truth, we know absolutely nothing. We know extremely little about how we function. We know very little about who we really are and what we are able of. We know even less about the reality around us. So up to that point, we will have maybe short moments of illumination in which we realize that we know absolutely nothing. When we will discover the true self, it will allow us to reach the final state of spiritual liberation. So discovering the ultimate godly truth, it will allow us to reach the state of spiritual liberation. And this is the aim of any true, genuine spiritual path. The revelation of the Supreme Self is a duty which every human being has in order to discover the Creator and thus to embrace Him with the same love with which God actually embraces us all the time, permanently. Consciously or not, we all suffer that we cannot be old. So the revelation of the immortal Supreme Self allows us to merge in a mysterious and ecstatic way with everything. And this is also leading to something else. It will help us experience many times a very special state of knowing without knowing. This frantic aspiration to merge, or otherwise the aspiration towards completion, manifests as a tendency to encapsulate, to embrace the entire environment, to absorb it in our inner universe. And this is what the great yogis and sages call for, transforming the external environment into our internal environment through merging and reflection. So you will feel when you start, for example, doing meditations for revelation of the Supreme Self, you'll have sometimes states in which you feel that you are everything, that inside of you is the entire universe, that you have somehow encapsulated in yourself the entire creation. It is characteristic for all reality, but only for those who manage to reveal the Supreme Self. This will remain true forever. When revealing Atman, morphing of the external environment into our inner universe brings a state of ecstasy, of ecstatic fusion, highlighting the very entrance into a very mysterious condition of to be. If you just pause for a short moment and think a little bit, ponder upon how you live your daily life, you'll have to admit that most of the time we aren't very much focused on to do, to have, and extremely little on to be. Focusing all the time on to do or on to have creates suffering, deception, frustration, stress, and misery, human misery of any form you can think of. When you are in the mysterious condition of to be, you will be peaceful, happy, balanced, harmonious, and so on. So this is a spiritual transformation. It is an achievement in the sphere of to be, is the very miracle of the human being who has revealed his or her immortal supreme self. It is essential to remember that you cannot be a yogi or a yogini without frantically aspiring to be yoga itself. And equally, you cannot be a spiritually liberated being without being the state of spiritual liberation itself. Knowing this, we need to realize that in order to truly reveal our immortal supreme self, Atman, we need to be this immortal self itself. The revelation of the immortal Supreme Self makes possible to enter into the condition of to be, to attain the state of deification, and thus to achieve the ultimate completion. We are all striving, we are all aspiring to feel complete, to attain this state of completion or perfection, no matter if we do it consciously or unconsciously. It is impregnated at the level of our DNA, it is in our cells, this frantic aspiration to discover who we really are. So when we do something consciously about it, of course, the process will take much shorter time than if we just allow life to push us from behind, so to say, in an unconscious manner. By revealing the Supreme Self, the being really makes a demutilation, getting out of the trap of, for example, loneliness, in which she feels confined, limited, without succeeding in embracing and encompassing in her turn, full of love, the infinity. It is very good from time to time to look at life, at ourselves and at others with a lot of transfiguration, and to really realize that we are like drops of perfection floating in an infinite ocean of love and happiness. So we are all the time encompassed by the infinity of God. We just need to remember this aspect from time to time so that we don't feel lonely, isolated, and sad. By revealing the immortal Supreme Self, the human being discovers that divine ideas are always mysterious realities which are distributed without being divided, exactly as the sunlight is. So the sun is just sharing its light without dividing it. It doesn't give it more to one person and less to another one. So the Supreme Self, when we start having glimpses of it more and more, we will also discover these divine ideas, which are mysterious realities that are all the time present within us and around us. So an example, a significant example, the fascinating beauty of a woman who has awakened the state of Shakti manifests itself as the light. It radiates as a delightful good, which is distributed without being divided. By revealing the immortal Supreme Self, we find that everything is mirrored in us, and we are united, intimately fused, and solidary with everything. So this will bring about an expansion of our consciousness, which will allow us to live almost all the time in an ecstatic state. The human being reaches thus the perfect state of spiritual detachment. And this is the good detachment of the wise person that is never distant or cold or contemptuous. So this detachment means that you actually placed yourself in the right position in the divine order of creation. You don't give yourself more importance or less importance than you are, and you actually give everybody their own place. And in this, if you want hierarchy, you will always place God on the first place. By revealing the immortal Supreme Self, the human being discovers that behind the so-called profane material reality, there is a gigantic, amazing concentration of the sacred which reveals God. In her spiritual evolution, the human being passes through different stages, each with certain characteristics. And the knowledge about them may open for us the path to higher levels which lead us to perfection. So now we will go shortly through these 7 different stages in the human spiritual evolution with their specific characteristics, so that you will be able to somehow map out this adventure of spiritual evolution, to understand better some, for example, some states that you experience, some situations that have the tendency to appear and reappear in your life often and more and more, because there are some life lessons that we didn't learn yet. And it will also help somehow, because you'll know what will follow next. The first stage, corresponding to Muladhara chakra, points out the ignorance or total lack of knowledge and even of information concerning the nature of mind, of consciousness and reality. This is, generally speaking, the case with the majority of human beings nowadays, who are mercantile, who are interested only in material gains, who can find to believe blindly only in what they can perceive with the 5 physical senses, or they believe only in the science, in the mechanicist technology of this material universe. When you start moving towards the second stage, corresponding to Svadhisthana chakra, it points out the sensitivity, more or less accentuated, toward other states of consciousness that can take place either fortuitous or in an organized, traditional manner. For example, you go to a yoga school and you start practicing yoga in an organized manner, so to speak. Sometimes the awakening of interest for spiritual issues may occur because of the onset of some ineffable inner resonance processes when reading a valuable spiritual text, or the testimony of a great master, or a very inspired movie, or simply talking to somebody who already has been on a spiritual path for a while and shares with you states, processes, thoughts regarding this really fascinating adventure of spiritual evolution. Sometimes you can even awaken the spiritual interest because you lived a mystical experience or elevated states of pure orgasm, or even by the paroxysm of painful existential crisis. So you see, you have both both extremes of the scale, both an existential crisis or elevated states of ecstatic orgasm, both that can trigger in you the interest for spiritual evolution. In other cases, the systematic attendance of a group of spiritual persons, or even the approach of a less conventional therapy, which is efficient, can awaken gradually in the human being beneficial, subtle forces that were previously unsuspected, and that will push you to ask intelligent questions that will make you understand that there is more to life than the material aspect of it. So after that, you will slightly progress more, and when you will enter the third stage, that corresponds to Manipura chakra. It will pinpoint the search full of aspiration for efficient methods of awakening for an authentic spiritual path. And this stage is characterized most often by a feverish search, frequently bookish. So people will read a lot, they want to understand, but they want to understand in an intellectual manner, not in a heart manner or in a consciousness manner. They will read a lot and they will maybe start practicing a little bit from the books without the help of somebody else. They will just use the books. And then we will think only of our object, and something inside us whispers that we are sometimes approaching the truth. Our lectures will confirm this later. We then earnestly seek a master or a spiritual guide, and we rush sometimes in what a great yogi called a spiritual cocktail. For example, a kind of combination of postures, therapies, esoteric lectures, which are mixed more or less with meditation techniques, martial arts, practices like Tai Chi, Aikido, biomagnetic healing, and so on and so forth. So you start because the thirst for spiritual evolution is there and now it is awakened and on the surface much more than the previous two stages. This thirst, you want to quench it, you want to give it nourishment and fuel, and you start mixing different types of so-called spiritual practices which do not belong to one and the same spiritual path. There are some people who unfortunately are fixed definitely only at this stage. And with the limited half-learned strength, they believe they found a way. But this is only the third level and there are 7. So please keep that in mind. There are also in this category those who immediately after the first spiritual experience think they are fully enlightened and they stop here. This is a big, big trap. And, you cheat yourself big time if you start having some spiritual states, some higher forms of consciousness experiences, and you start believing that you are enlightened and that's it. This is the ultimate level and you stop here. This is a big trap. And if you do that, of course, you stop your entire evolution. But others will meet at the end of their journey their true way and their true spiritual master or spiritual guide. Only then the great spiritual adventure starts for them. So even if you are already on the in the third stage, still this is more or less the beginning of your journey, the beginning of your adventure. The 4th stage, corresponding to Anahata Chakra, highlights the full of aspiration and consistent approach to a genuine spiritual path. So here your whole approach will transform a lot because now it is the spiritual heart leading you on this path and not so much the willpower and also the ego, which are specific for the 3rd level. So during this stage, the human being gradually discovers the barriers that often impede the true knowledge and also learns progressively to dissolve these obstacles with patience, perseverance, dedication, generosity. Specific methods used herein varies depending on the chosen path. And because we are on yoga, of course, that the methods we use on this yoga path will belong to the integral yoga system. They can change at a time, depending also on the personal spiritual evolution and according to certain individual conditions. So we start, for example, with a daily spiritual practice, or what it is called the tapas in the yoga tradition. And at a certain point, you will notice that now you achieved results. And some situations in your life, including inner conditions, transformed, and therefore the tapas needs to be adjusted. So according to these outer and inner conditions, you will from time to time change what you practice so that it fits the best your necessities at that point in life. However, the human being who seeks to achieve the ultimate spiritual stage, she has to never stop her spiritual practice. It's logic, it's common sense, it's obvious. It will thus extend gradually on her everyday existence. I often speak with my yoga students that having a spiritual practice doesn't imply that you strange yoga postures or meditation on a yoga mat in a yoga hall. Spiritual practice means that after you have practiced the yoga techniques in a yoga hall with the yoga teacher, when you go out through the door, you will have now to apply practically all these aspects that you have learned and all those wonderful states that you have achieved during the yoga practice in the yoga hall in your daily life. And that is actually showing you that you understood correctly, that you now stabilize and assimilate the states you had while practicing yoga in a yoga hall. So you need to extend gradually the spiritual practice in your everyday existence. This stage is prolonged and maintained practically unchanged in the other stages which follow. So this awareness, almost continuous awareness that what you think, what you feel, what you say, how you behave, what you do are integrated in your daily spiritual practice, and they need to follow certain divine laws and divine principles, occult principles. Then you will have this awareness upon this aspect unchanged in all the other stages which will follow. So now the fifth stage, corresponding to Vishuddha chakra, pinpoints the emotional stabilization and a deep state of inner peace. As the obstacles dissolve and are completely removed away from our consciousness, which here corresponds to the identification and control of the intimate origins of our destructive feelings and emotions, our unhealthy feelings and emotions, the mental agitation of the thoughts diminishes and the profound euphoric peace installs in us. So when you will be able to maintain this inner peace, euphoric peace, no matter the life situations, no matter the challenges, no matter who or what will do their best to trigger you without succeeding, then you know that more or less you are in touch with this stage. Maybe you are not finally stabilized in it, but you are entering it more and more often. And this is an absolutely necessary condition for what will follow. Although there are some spiritual paths which take advantage of all the conflicts that occur in the human being, using them as some direct and immediate means to attain transcendence. You don't need to do that necessarily. So this stage is generally accompanied by a correct, profound understanding of both the nature of reality and the nature of mind and consciousness. The human being aspires now with power that this profound euphoric peace will embrace the whole world. So of course, when you experience this deep state of euphoric peace, you want it for the other ones to feel it, to experience it as well. And the deeper you can feel it yourself, the more you can somehow exude it yourself, the more you will share it with others. So at this stage, the ability to love greatly enhances. And now we move to the sixth stage, corresponding to Ajna chakra, which refers to achieving non-duality. Up to this stage, the human being was often the theater of the manifestation of many phenomena, in the meaning of the Greek word designating illusory appearances, such as visions of shapes and lights, listening to the inner sounds, perceiving some subtle energy vibration, which then give birth to parapsychic manifestations, regressions, for example, to previous lives, of your own or of other human beings whom we come into contact with, and so on and so forth. A competent spiritual master will help us then to understand that almost all these phenomena are as illusory as a dream or as ordinary as the physical universe. In all these experiences, there is still a vivid illusion of separation between subject and object of its perception, so between us and what we perceive, appearing sometimes even the risk of strengthening the perpetuation of this illusion of separation, and also triggering something else that I will present as soon as we go through the 7 stages. That is quite a big trap, and we need to make sure we don't fall into it, or when we notice that we've failed, we are humans, we do the best to take ourselves out of it as soon as possible. Complete dissolution of this phantasm leads progressively. So the phantasm that I refer here to is the illusion of separation, that we are separated from the rest. When we succeed in dissolving it completely, it will lead us progressively to the appearance of a holistic, ineffable, a-conceptual experience. We don't label anymore the reality. We just are. We feel it without having the discursive mind, the verbal mind, the rational mind, labeling everything, comparing everything, and actually creating the duality, we and the rest. So from the initial stage, if you remember when we spoke of Muladhara chakra, from the initial stage of dualistic ignorance, we go to the true divine knowledge at the level of Ajna chakra, to that state of impersonal presence in which we realize, amazed, that there is no one in particular who knows. Love for all human beings then becomes divine light and is revealed to us as what it actually was in reality forever, from the beginning, without beginnings. So now we will reach the 7th stage of our spiritual evolution, corresponding to Sahasrara chakra. It marks spiritual liberation. While in the previous stage, the real nature was perceived in the form of illuminating deep glimpses, now the presence of God, or the true knowledge, is permanently installed, and it remains constant without being ever lost. Relative absolute dichotomy is now obsolete. So we do not perceive reality as dual. We do not feel any more separated. We do not think, feel, experience in this term that there is something relative and that there is something absolute. It's completely gone. There are no longer concepts, conditionings, but only a supreme light space, immeasurable and radiant. At the same time, we discover amazed that oceanic love, encompassing knowledge, are crossing this body, but definitely they are not limited to it. Only when we realize that this was a primordial state, which in reality existed in ourselves always, but it was completely hidden by our previous ignorance. And this will be really an amazing, ecstatic experience. Now we will realize that the veil is completely dissolved. We are one with everything. We are one with God. So in our process of spiritual evolution, normally we will also come across the biggest hinder, or what it is we can call the spiritual ego, quote unquote. It is one of the most delicate stages in spiritual evolution, the emergence of this so-called quote unquote spiritual ego. This stage occurs after we've passed through several levels of initiation on the spiritual path and already have the necessary data to, so to say, walk alone. So we don't need to ask so many questions anymore. We have enough understanding, or we think so, of what we need to do, what a spiritual path implies, what a spiritual practice requires, and so on. So now we can more or less walk alone. We don't need so much external help. How can we notice the appearance of this spiritual ego so that we can thwart the maneuvers that can unfortunately keep us captive in the ego's tight shell? So I will follow you through some of the aspects. So I will present different characteristics of the spiritual ego with the practical solution, how we can get rid of those strategies and maneuvers that the ego tries to keep us captive. So knowing about these characteristic aspects is important, because by identifying the symptoms of its arousal, it can be much easier to act and do beneficial transformations so that we get ourselves out of the trap of ego, which creates this so-called spiritual ego. One of the characteristics of spiritual ego emergence is that, like any structure of the ego, this one, the spiritual, so-called spiritual ego, is characterized by the tendency to separate from the whole. Meaning, this is one of the very clear signs by which the appearance of so-called spiritual ego can be easily observed if we analyze with great detachment and lucidity the facts and the actions. So this analysis of facts and actions needs to be done without taking into account the motivations, but especially the final results, because the motivations are actually arguments that the ego comes with in order to trick us, of course. So it is very difficult not to notice this tendency of separation from, for example, the spiritual group you belong to, the path that until then represented everything for you, the ideas that until then guided your life. But when there is a tendency in a certain person to separate from principles, ideas that until then were assumed to be directions of evolution, it shows very clearly that this form of ego, the spiritual ego, has appeared. And when that happens, of course, the solution is that you go back to the group that you, spiritual group that you belong to. You can, for example, engage yourself in karma yoga activities with a group so that you help the spiritual school, the yoga school you belong to. You pay attention and as I mentioned, don't look at the motivations, because the motivations can be a colleague said that to me or did that to me, or it doesn't matter. The motivations, be very careful. They are arguments that the ego comes with, so that you will be convinced that you are right. This is not about being right. This is about keeping yourself on track on the spiritual path, no matter which challenges we are confronted with. So when this tendency to separate from the group we belong to, or the path that we follow, or the divine principles that we follow, we need to reintegrate ourselves in the spiritual group, no matter how difficult it is. It is difficult for the ego, but not for ourselves. And as suggestion, as a recommendation from our spiritual guide, I spoke with him about this topic and about this webinar in particular, and he suggested to us to always remember the meditations with the divine attributes. Doing meditations with the godly attributes is one of the most rapid, the most efficient solutions, even to getting rid of the spiritual ego. Another tendency in this direction, when the spiritual ego appears, is forgetting, is another treacherous form of the spiritual, so-called spiritual ego. So in this case, the human being simply forgets certain aspirations and ideals that she or he had in the beginning, gradually allowing them to be replaced by some much lower and coarser ones. So, for example, in the beginning, when we started with the yoga practice on this yoga path, we practiced many hours per day and we were fascinated by all the spiritual knowledge that we received. After many years, maybe the aspirations started to decrease, and the ideals, when we started, maybe our ideal was to reveal our immortal supreme self, to discover who we really are and thus become one with God. And now, many years later, or some years later, some people may start having as an aspiration or an ideal, but actually I want to have a house and a bigger car, and I don't have enough money, so I would like to have a little bit more money. So if you notice that instead of having as number one priority your spiritual evolution and the revelation, self-realization, and now the ideals that start appearing are material ones, this is a clear sign that the spiritual ego took over. It is a gradual process that creeps into the human being due to small daily compromises. And it doesn't appear suddenly, because if you do, it will be too easy to detect it and to get back on the right path. So small daily compromises are, unfortunately, stealing our aspiration, killing our aspiration, and start making this very perverse shift from noble spiritual ideals to materialistic ones, which are definitely not helping us at all. This tendency can be counteracted by, with a lot of humbleness, recalling the states, the aspirations we had when we were much less evolved, so to say. So we can counteract it by a return to the energy of the beginning and the resumption of the values initially established. So doing meditation with the divine attribute of divine beginning, the energy of the beginning, is also a practical solution. Another aspect in connection with the spiritual ego, the impression that you know enough. This impression often appears to those who study a lot and who get to know a lot of aspects and therefore do not have actually time to experience them practically directly. So they are very scholar-like and very focused on the intellectual aspect of spiritual evolution, but not practice directly all those aspects. So after a while, they will have this false impression, now I know enough. This false impression is another facet of the so-called spiritual ego. So this false impression of knowing enough is a very dangerous trap, because it takes you away from true spiritual knowledge. So true spiritual knowledge is not intellectual. True spiritual knowledge is through direct experience of divine laws, of principles, of manifestation. So when you experience them in your being and you truly understand how they function, that is spiritual knowledge, not necessarily the fact that you learn Sanskrit so that you can read the old yoga books, or that you read a lot of spiritual books and have a lot of information. So mental information is not spiritual knowledge. In this category also is included self-sufficiency. So there are some persons who start practicing yoga and they start having some results, and they have enough aspiration for a while. And because these results sometimes can be really of the domain of paranormal, they start thinking, but now I'm enlightened. Now I am enough. I know enough. I don't have to do more. This is I already attained the highest level of evolution. This is a big trap. So we need to pay attention when we notice this tendency to self-sufficiency and the false impression that we know enough. It's the alarm shouting, spiritual ego is in place. Everything seems already known, and nothing new awakens the thirst for knowledge. This results in the gradual disappearance of transfiguration and self-transfiguration. And perhaps the worst effect of this state is the closure in our heart toward the knowledge of the self. So this is the worst effect of the false impression of knowing enough and self-sufficiency. The state of self-sufficiency can be successfully counteracted if we aim to keep ourselves always open to the situations that arise in life and to learn the lessons of each one with humbleness. So we can meditate a lot with the godly attribute of godly humbleness, and to keep our heart and our consciousness open to the situations in life and to learn from every single one of them. So, true genuine masters, they learn from God down to the smallest creature you can imagine. A person with a big spiritual ego doesn't learn from anybody anymore because they think, I'm enough, I know enough. So it is a real benefit to look at any situation or person that comes our way in life as a direct reflection of ourselves, and to always look for the lesson we need to learn from that person or existential situation. And having this very healthy attitude to always keep in mind or keep in your consciousness that everything that comes into our life is a direct reflection of ourselves. So when situations which are disharmonious appear in our life, that's a reflection of ourselves. So we can ask ourselves without criticizing or putting us down. We can think, all right, what does reflect in me? Do I have something which I need to harmonize, to get rid of, to improve? Of course, until we reach the supreme state of spiritual liberation, there will always be aspects in us to be improved and harmonized. So if we maintain this state of humbleness, looking at everything as a teacher, at a spiritual teacher, which has something to learn us, it will keep us away from the spiritual ego and its traps. And for this we can, and it's even necessary, to use all the lessons we have learned so far, theoretically and practically, and apply them. Make use of them in our daily life. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, yoga doesn't imply only to practice yoga postures on a yoga mat in a yoga hall with the yoga teacher. Yoga means to live your life in a certain way. So all this needs to be done on a background of a state of purity, candor, similar to the state that, for example, children have when they learn. If you have the possibility, the opportunity to notice how kids learn, we can learn a lot from them again. So, sorry. Also, meditation with the state of pure, the godly attribute of purity is also of great help. Concrete actions until the results are obtained has a very important, also almost magical effect. If the assimilated knowledge up to a certain point has a little bit the tendency to block the understanding on a certain level. So if we notice that we have the tendency more to listen and to read, not so much to practice, then we can start doing concrete actions, not only practicing yoga postures, but also concrete actions in our daily life until we obtain the results, because that will have a very magical effects also on our aspirations. So another trap of the spiritual, another symptom of spiritual ego, the so-called spiritual ego, is the lack of aspiration. And this is a problem that arises with the so-called spiritual ego and perversely infiltrates the soul of the aspirant over time. All the actions we do not complete, all the compromises we make with ourselves and others, all these create a shell that no longer allows inspiration and divine grace to manifest in our being. So gradually the aspiration is more and more frail. It will fade, it will disappear. The biggest problem here is that when we obviously notice this process, is a little bit too late. Not definitely too late, but it's a bit too late, because the effort required to repair the lack of aspiration, it will be very big, because we don't have so much left of the aspiration. And this situation can be avoided primarily by preventing it to appear. This prevention is easy to achieve when we constantly seek to fulfill all the good decisions we make and to carry out everything good that we started. We need to also always do everything we know it's necessary for our spiritual evolution without compromising, no matter how difficult sometimes it may seem to be or even is. Another symptom of the spiritual ego is the lack of faith. It's another facet of this so-called spiritual ego. It is installed on the background of declining transfiguration and self-transfiguration power. This power of transfiguration diminishes due to all the moments when, although we could choose the higher resonances, we chose to indulge in lower ones. A very clear sign that this facet of the spiritual ego has appeared is that miracles are happening less and less in our lives. If in the beginning, under our astonished, transfigured eyes, the gates to invisible worlds were opened, now even the most obvious miracles most often remain indifferent to us. And this state inevitably leads to diminished faith. Most situations that formed a sacred space in our lives now fall into the realm of the profane. And this decrease is a dramatic fall down of our spiritual level. In order to avoid diminishing faith, we need to carefully cultivate the capacity for transfiguration and self-transfiguration. So meditation with the godly attribute of godly transfiguration will be of great help. We need to always choose the highest aspects that we can perceive in certain situations, and do not accept to compromise, to indulge in low resonances as we did before. In other words, we need to always follow the essentials and set aside what is not essential. It might not be the easiest path to follow, but it is the quickest path to perfection. Another aspect that we can accomplish to remove this facet of the so-called spiritual ego from our lives is to sustain our inner beliefs through deeds that are reflected in daily life. Thus, for example, if we say that the most important thing in our lives is to love, then we need to do so that we manifest love all the time. And especially in difficult situations, and especially with people that triggers, pushes some points, some weak points, some weak spots in us, that it will be really the signs that we do love. We don't just say we love, but we love. Another symptom of the spiritual ego is the lack of patience. And this is one of the most common causes why some of those who walk the spiritual path are eventually astray or even diverted. If at first the aspirant, the yoga practitioner, has the patience to work with himself or herself, even though the results are difficult to see, when the so-called spiritual ego appears, the aspirant no longer has the patience to practice enough the techniques so that the results have a chance to appear. Although now, and pay attention, this is a very important aspect, although now those results appear much easier, and it is logical because we practiced yoga for quite a long time. We paved the path, we removed some obstacles, some blockages, we purified ourselves, we heightened our level of vibration, our resonance. So now when we practice a certain technique, it will take less time and it will confer us greater results than in the beginning. But if we don't have the patience to practice enough the techniques, we will not allow the results to appear. So if in the beginning, only after sustained efforts for weeks and even months, the results could barely be felt, for example, in a hatha yoga session, now a few days of systematic practice of a technique would be enough for very strong effects and results to appear. But due to this loss of patience, we are tempted to end the practice much earlier so that the technique doesn't have a chance to confer us the results. Patience is a virtue, and like any other virtue, it is amplified by practicing it as much as possible. We can also practice meditation with the godly attribute of godly patience. So we need to begin to be patient with those around us, but also with ourselves. It's very important that we also have patience with ourselves. And this time we need not to be patient with our weaknesses, but we need to be patient with the spiritual needs of our being. And if we need a few hours of meditation every day to feel good, we need to be patient and give us what we need. You know, there is a Zen saying, if you are agitated, it's clearly that you need to practice meditation for at least 20 minutes a day. And if you think you don't have time, then you need to practice meditation for 1 hour a day. So it is very helpful to practice meditation because it amplifies, among other things, also the patience. And practicing meditation, actually, it's a very good training for our patience, because when you practice yoga postures, you have another level of control upon your physical body. But when you practice meditation, then you will have to notice the level of control you have upon your mind, and therefore the patience will be greatly challenged. Patience is based on a great confidence that everything happens in direct harmony with the will of God, without the slightest exception. He or she who is truly patient is a winner in the struggle with time, and she or he will often experience the state of eternity. Another symptom of the spiritual ego is the lack of humbleness. Pride kills the ability to give and makes the being stop learning. The consciousness of the one's own value is also included here. So he who truly evolves spiritually understands more and more that God is in every human being, in every object, and therefore everything can teach us a lesson at the right time. The humble one sees how everything is done by the will of God. And that is why he cannot be fooled as to, I have done it. So when you have the state of humbleness, and one very good practical manner to achieve a true state of humbleness in front of God is practicing karma yoga. Because when you practice karma yoga truly, so not voluntary work, but karma yoga, you will never think, I done it, I did it, I've done it. You will always be aware that God is doing all these aspects, phenomena, things through you. So you will not be able to be fooled as to, I have done it. Pride is one of the sins that can become very subtle, and that is why we need to constantly seek to amplify the state of humbleness. The proud one lives in a world populated only by the ghosts of his own thoughts. And in my previous webinar, we spoke the entire hour about mental ghosts. But what is worse is that no one can convince him that there is something wrong in that direction, and thus the deviation can become very big in a very short time. In order to remove this situation, the aspirant needs to always maintain the common sense and amplify his state of humility as much as possible. So you can do the meditation with the godly attribute of godly humbleness. Also, another way to do this is to forgive. And again, you can amplify the godly attribute of forgiveness in your being. The forgiveness of the wrongdoer is a true spiritual desideratum that appears even in the Bible. Forgiveness creates an unforgiving and imperturbable state of peace. Those who know how to forgive have a serene life, and this gradually leads to the awakening of the soul and to the breaking of the ego's shell, even the breaking of the spiritual ego one. Another symptom of spiritual ego is the inability to give, to offer. It causes the soul to dry out, to atrophy stiffly into a too great a care for one's own person. And this is also where the egoism that makes us cling excessively to our own spiritual evolution enters, making it only a shield to hide the egoism and the incapacity of that person. We often meet people who go on a spiritual path, but in reality they are engaged on the path of their own ego. This happens because the one who does not have enough strength when he has made some progress becomes extremely stingy, so to say. The more stingy you are because of the impression that you have what you have will not be enough for you, of course, the more you resonate with the state of inadequacy, with the state of lack, of not enough. And what you will have will diminish and will be lost because you are afraid that that will happen. Of course, that will happen because you attract it to you. So the easiest way to combat this condition is by giving, by being very, very generous. And also you can use the godly attribute of godly generosity. By seeking to offer totally and as detachedly as possible the fruits of our actions to God, we can become again foci through which God manifests himself. Another symptom of the spiritual ego is the lack of spontaneity and inner freedom. If at first the aspirant is willing to permanently exceed his limits, now it is clear that he is caught in the straps of other habits, this time spiritual ones. So now such a person who developed the spiritual ego will have a spiritual practice, so will have some spiritual habits, but will maintain only those ones and will never do something to exceed the limits, to get out of this new box which has nicer walls, golden ones, but still it is a box, still it is a prison. So it's very clear how the state of inner freedom diminishes and the kind of a aging of the respective souls appears. So the frustration in carrying out one's own work schedule causes the inner freedom to be lost, and this time in favor of a better cause. So now you don't work, maybe I just take it as a scenario, maybe you don't work you don't have a normal job in a normal company. Now you do a lot of spiritual work in a spiritual school or organization, so it's a better cause. But again, you just do this work without the inner freedom and without paying attention, so that you don't just fall into habits, even if they are so-called spiritual ones. In reality, still, this is still a prison. Especially those who act mechanically in performing the spiritual practice. So when they train yoga, but they do it mechanically, they are exposed to the appearance of this terrible facet of the spiritual ego. A deep, lucid understanding of the necessity of spiritual evolution is necessary in order to remove this state. In order for these new spiritual barriers to be removed, sadhana, or the daily spiritual training, needs to be understood as an instrument and not as an end in itself. Cultivating an attitude of strength, courage, specific to the concept of Vira or spiritual hero, is very useful in this regard. Another symptom of the spiritual ego is the lack of enthusiasm. This is the clearest sign that the darkening of the soul is occurring. The soul is no longer fed with fresh energies coming from the spiritual ideal, which is now almost forgotten. What used to be fascinating and fed our soul with huge energies is now forgotten. It's necessary that the effort of transfiguration, self-transfiguration, be permanently maintained. The biggest enemy in this direction is the feeling that now you know enough and you don't have to be as naive as you used to be in the beginning of your yoga life. So, throwing aside the naivety you had in the beginning, many aspirants also throw away with it the transfiguration. Also, lack of results poisons the soul and destroys the enthusiasm, even in the case of the most experienced aspirants. It is known that the enthusiasm a person shows is a clear sign of the success that person has in no matter which fields of their life. Obviously, the reciprocal is also true. So it's necessary that from this point of view, we should always be careful to carry out what we started until obtaining the expected results. I'm a yoga teacher and a tantra teacher, so of course I hear my students commenting on their progress. I heard it so many times, people saying, I have started the practice of Laya yoga technique, so the advanced form of meditation with the mantra. I don't hear the sound, I don't have any results, it means it doesn't work. No, it just means that you need to continue until you obtain results, because in your case, you as an individual have some blockages that you need to remove in order for the absolutely ecstatic effects of meditating with the mantra to appear also in your being. So if we started practicing, for example, the Laya yoga technique, then we practice it until we obtain results. We don't stop in the middle of it because we don't have results yet. Another symptom is a low spiritual efficiency. Correlated with diminished aspiration and enthusiasm, this lack of efficiency leads to the absence of results, obviously, and this gradually poisons the soul. It is a sign that can be noticed, but that cannot be stopped without removing the causes discussed above. Another symptom of the spiritual ego is the inability to love deeply. This sign is easy to spot, but it's difficult for most people to accept. So, of course, we all want to believe that we are loving, that we have a deep ability to love. If we are truly sincere, honest with ourselves, we will notice that our ability to love has room for improvement. And from my own experience, there will come a moment in everyone's life when they will discover through direct experience what true love really means. For me, it was a shock, really. So when I felt what truly loving actually means, I had a shock, because I realized, looking back at all the moments in which I really believed I was loving, I understood that it was a caricature compared to the true ability to love. What I used to call love was really a caricature. So at this level, we need to know that love is one of the central elements of any spiritual practice, and it is able to nullify any form of ego. So I will say it again because it's of extreme importance. We need to know that love is one of the central elements of any spiritual practice, and it is able to nullify any form of ego. So the more we love, the less our ego will get. When we will love infinitely, there is no more space for ego. The ego will be gone. We can systematically train ourselves to love more and more than up to now. We also have the godly attribute of divine love that we can attract and accumulate more and more in our being. So it's very important to do this, especially when we see a limitation in this direction. If we notice that right now I can love more, then love more. So this ability to love is a very good spiritual barometer, and it needs to be used by anyone who really wants to evolve spiritually very effectively. Another symptom of the spiritual ego is the absence of the state of harmonious integration. Many people, when they walk the spiritual path, they are fascinated by the discovery of the game of synchronicities. Their life enters a new dimension of reality, which is magic. But when the spiritual ego appears, the so-called spiritual ego appears, this state of perfect integration somehow begins to diminish until it disappears. Of course, because you put the ego in between you and the cosmic order. And this is a clear stage that indicates the appearance of the spiritual ego. And instead of integration in your life, you have more disintegration. Harmonious integration in life is a state of abandonment of the individual will in front before the will of God. So this is the solution. When you notice that you struggled and you make huge efforts and nothing goes your way, it's a sign that you are not integrated in the cosmic harmony. And then instead of doing your will, it's much wiser to do God's will. This can be achieved in several ways, but each time the result is the same. The universe suddenly becomes alive. It responds to all our actions in a coherent and wise way. So the harmoniously integrated being does not make any effort. Everything flows in a mysterious, natural way because we are integrating in the cosmic harmony. Life becomes a fascinating lesson in which every detail has a great mark placed by a gigantic intelligence that is now revealed at every step we take. To regain this state, if it has been lost to the spiritual ego, all of the above conditions need to be met. So this was a brief description of the marvelous adventure of spiritual evolution with its 7 stages, but also with the hinders that come from our spiritual ego. So Jessica is asking, will I feel the stage I am in? Definitely. So if you pay attention a little bit to the description that I offered, you will feel the stage in which you are without any doubt. Of course, there will be also the ego coming with its strategies to divert us from the path, and all those symptoms of the spiritual ego are also very good to know about them, so that you understand when some of them appear that we need to remove them. But otherwise, you will definitely notice, for example, the fourth stage, in which now you have this commitment to the spiritual ideals. Now you do your daily practice in a very generous manner. Now you stop making compromises. You apply the knowledge and the understandings and the states that you feel during the yoga practice in a yoga hall or at home in your daily life. Or if you are in the fifth stage of purity and deep inner peace, which is always there, no matter the situations, no matter the challenges, you will definitely notice that you are in that stage. So with the stages, it's not very difficult to pay attention and become aware that, yes, now I am entering the fourth stage. Generally speaking, there are not many people who are, for example, in the fifth stage. Most of the persons that I know are in the first four ones, most of them, or even in the first three ones. Every one of us has a pace of evolution, our rhythm of evolution. So sooner or later, we will all go through them. Now, or a little bit later in another life. I have also a question in the chat. Sometimes we cannot pay attention to all the signs of entering into so-called spiritual ego frequency. We are carried away by life, and when we realize we went astray, it is difficult to come back on track. How can we approach it in an integrated way? The best is to have patience with yourself, to have self-compassion, to understand that okay, now I stepped a little bit out of the spiritual path, and to start practicing more, not a whole more from the start, because it will not work, but to practice more and more each day, gradually increase the spiritual practice, and that will start giving you results, which in its turn will give you more aspiration, enthusiasm, faith. So also helping you not making so many compromises. So in this manner, you can approach it in this integrated way. Just practice a little bit more every day. So spiritual practice will always be the answer, no matter the questions, by the way. Okay, then I thank you a lot for joining me for this webinar. I hope that the information I have presented is of practical use for you, that you can have some help from it, and I will see you next month for a next webinar. Until then, please take care of you, and I wish all of us an accelerated spiritual evolution.